Thank you. Welcome to Cambridge Forum with Philip Winslow discussing In the West Bank, based on his new book, Victory for Us is to See You Suffer, in the West Bank with the Palestinians and the Israelis. I'm Sarah Roy, Senior Research Scholar at Harvard Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Philip Winslow has worked as a journalist for more than 20 years in print, radio, and television news. As Southern Africa correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor radio network, he covered the civil war in Angola, part of the Rwandan genocide and subsequent refugee crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the intervention of mercenaries in Sierra Leone's civil war. His previous book, Sowing the Dragon's Teeth, Landmines and the Global Legacy of War, grew out of these experiences, particularly his work in Angola. Phil has also worked for the United Nations on peacekeeping missions in the former Yugoslavia and in Sierra Leone. Most recently, he worked in the West Bank with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees from 2001 to 2004 during the Second Intifada. His new book presents a first-hand account of ordinary people's lives in this dangerous part of the world, offering an uncensored view of the realities on the ground that have made enduring peace in the region so difficult to achieve. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Philip Winslow.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roy, for that. It's a pleasure to be introduced by a writer with your degree of eloquence and writing power. So if you haven't read Dr. Roy's material, I recommend it. A bit of background about me. There's one thing sometimes that confuses people is having moved back and forth since the 90s between journalism and humanitarian aid work. I was covering the war in the former Yugoslavia in the early 90s and was offered a job by a UN peacekeeping mission. So that kind of gave me a taste for UN peacekeeping, in which I believed, at least in theory. Anyway, so I had moved back and forth, and then in 2001, I was offered a job in the West Bank with UNRWA, which is the acronym for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. And a bit of background on UNRWA. First of all, UNRWA has been working with Palestine refugees in the West Bank, Gaza, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon since 1950. It was created by the General Assembly after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Now, over the course of the years, and by the way, UNRWA is primarily a Palestinian organization as far as its employees are concerned. It's a UN and international organization and UN mandated, but with something like 25,000 employees in those 5 fields, almost all of them are Palestinians. Only 100 plus are internationals. So over the years, UNRWA has become, you might say, part of the regional furniture in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, the West Bank, and Gaza. And with that number of Palestinian employees, UNRWA garners, you might say, a fair bit of antipathy from the Israeli authorities, both the civilian and military authorities. Although UNRWA operates under bilateral agreement. Israel hosts UNRWA, and UNRWA provides services to the Palestinians, such as food, education, and so on. What UNRWA, by the way, does not do is administer or run the refugee camps. In the West Bank, there are 19 refugee camps. UNRWA does not administer them, but UNRWA does administer services in the camps, that is, schools, health clinics, and various social welfare programs for the Palestinians. A couple of things, both about the book and my general role. When I say I did this or I did that, I want to make it clear that I was not alone. I worked as part of a field operations unit called the Operations Support Program of UNRWA. And we worked in two-person teams. I think we had 5 teams when I was there, and we worked with one international with a Palestinian assistant. I did not work in Gaza, so I mentioned Gaza only peripherally in the book and here tonight, although the situation in Gaza, about which Dr. Roy has written so well, despite that serious situation, I simply wasn't there. We had other teams that did do that. Now, I mentioned a bit about UNRWA being part of the regional furniture because despite the bilaterals between UNRWA and the government of Israel, when things get hot in the field, the Israeli military become very single-minded, as militaries everywhere do, and a lot of the agreements to allow the distribution of aid to the refugee camps and the villages, things were simply canceled. So back in the first Intifada, between 87 and 92, UNRWA set up a similar type of program, and it was carried over, or rather reconstituted, for the second Intifada, which began in September 2000. And my job was multifaceted. I spent most of my time negotiating with the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, and the Border Police to get humanitarian aid through the checkpoints into the refugee camps. Again, when things are hot, the security services, the Israeli security services, would shut things down, and Palestinians would be stuck at the checkpoints, and so would our aid convoys. So this was the point of this. And I also monitored and assessed road security at the checkpoints, on the roads, in the refugee camps, and negotiated with the Israeli security forces to get aid into the camps during the fighting. 2000 through 2004 was a very violent period, violence on both sides, and because of the virtual collapse of the Palestinian economy, the Palestinians required aid, so that's what we did. I finished in 2004, and then I went back in 2006 in the last summer, and spent 3 months there because I wanted to pursue some things that I couldn't really pursue when I worked for the UN. Our mandate was one of neutrality and providing humanitarian aid. But I got to know people on both sides. Now, we were tasked with working with the Palestinians. So if anybody thinks that my views are somewhat biased, the sheer weight of where I spent most of my time was in the refugee camps and with the Palestinians. But as a negotiator in the field, I got to know a lot of the soldiers. And a couple of things happened. Because I have spent close to 25 years in various parts of the world with soldiers of one kind or another, I'm comfortable with soldiers, whether they're Israeli or American or wherever they're from. I know how they think, I know what they do. And the other thing was, I got kind of a somewhat easier ride at times at the checkpoints simply because of my accent. An Israeli soldier, it was tense all the time. And when we would pull up to a checkpoint, we would have weapons leveled on us, and then they would hear my accent and would start to relax a little bit. Unfortunately, I didn't know anything about basketball, which Israelis are big basketball people, and I was always asked about the Celtics, and which I mispronounced as Celtics, I think, one time. So sorry about that. But anyway, I found that because of where I've spent so many years and what I have done, I relate to soldiers very well, even when whether they're behaving badly or behaving properly, I understand them. So it was very interesting, and a lot of times soldiers would come up to me, and during sometimes these hours-long negotiations to get an aid convoy through or to get medical teams through when things were really falling apart, you wind up hanging around by a tank or something, just waiting. You had a lot of time on your hands, and soldiers would come up to me and say, listen, we're here defending Israel, but at the same time, there's something about what we're doing that's not right, and I want you to know that I'm not like that. And I knew what they meant, but it was, anyway, I was really curious and wanted to, and I got to know, we had liaison officers who were appointed to work with us. They were usually mid-rank officers, lieutenants, captains, and mostly majors. So we spent a lot of time with these guys and got to know each other quite well. So I wanted to go back to see what there was in the way of common ground between Israelis and Palestinians. I mean, they share this small piece of land. So I went back for 3 months in 2006, and I went back for a month this summer and just came back. Now, we drove outrageous distances. I mean, 600 miles a week up and down the West Bank between all these refugee camps and the checkpoints. And now, for example, just to give you a bit of geographical orientation, I'm sure you all already know it, but the West Bank is about the size of the state of Delaware. And in the West Bank alone, in September, there were 563 obstacles or barriers, not counting the wall, of one kind or another. This is manned checkpoints, earth mounds, trenches, concrete blocks across the road, wire across the road, and this sort of thing. And it really makes life very difficult for the Palestinians, quite apart from what's going on the military front. And I had been hearing from friends on both sides over the past 2 years something I hadn't heard so much of when I was there through 2004, which was a degree of hopelessness. And Palestinians and a lot of Israelis, Israelis were saying things to me like, I wonder if we're going to have a state of Israel in another generation if we keep doing this. And these statements that I found quite shocking. And Palestinians were saying, this is our life, we are stuck with this, nothing is going to change, we will never have a state. And so I conducted a lot of interviews last year and this degree of hopelessness about the situation ever ending is quite prevalent. So that is generally what I did and why. And I left the UN agency. I left UNRWA in 2004. And so I thought maybe I would, if time is all right here, I might just read a couple of things from the book, some short excerpts. And this is from the first chapter. At times, the whole conflict seemed to boil down to this one case of attempted murder. Driving through the hill country west of Nablus on a clear October day in my first week on the job, we came up behind a yellow Mercedes Palestinian taxi with 3 female passengers in the back seat. A passenger car was approaching from the opposite direction. As the oncoming car got closer, a hand reached out the driver's side window, fingers curled around a rock the size of a grapefruit. In one fluid motion, the arm hauled back and fired, and the rock, seemingly in slow motion, crashed through the windscreen of the taxi. The settler's arm withdrew into the car. As our vehicles flashed past each other, his bearded, heavy face was a frozen snarl, lips pulled back over his teeth. He was gone in an instant. The settler's aim and judgment of trajectory in the combined vehicle speeds had been precise. The rock punched through the left center of the windscreen and struck the driver square in the forehead. Amazingly, he managed to stop without plunging off the side of the hill. We slithered around and stopped in front of him. We were alone on a remote stretch of road. The Palestinian women, wearing fancy clothes and gold jewelry for the wedding they were about to attend, got out of the back seat. One wore a long green dress. My 2 colleagues quickly bandaged the head wound of the driver, who was now unconscious and lying on his back on the cold pavement, and I got on the radio. A Palestinian ambulance was summoned, and eventually IDF and Israeli police jeeps pulled up. The soldiers gave the situation a cursory glance and drove off, and the police officer unenthusiastically took my report, brushing off details of the attack. I'm the one doing the investigation, he said. He drove away, an ambulance arrived, and we left. The freeze frames hovered in front of me, the settler's outstretched arm, the rock leaving his hand, his contorted, angry face, the taxi driver's blood-spattered shirt, and the finely dressed women in their gold earrings and bracelets standing on the lonely road, waiting for another taxi to pass. This incident didn't make the papers. Soldiers across the West Bank were hunting for the assassins of Israel's tourism minister, Rehavam Ze'evi, and the country was in an uproar about other murderous attacks that month. In one, Hamas gunmen armed with rifles and grenades infiltrated a small Jewish settlement in the Gaza Strip, killing 2 teenagers and wounding 14. 2 days later, a Palestinian disguised as an Israeli soldier killed 2 and wounded 10 in the bus station in Afula, Israel. In response to the upsurge in such attacks, particularly the murder of a cabinet minister, IDF armored and infantry units had invaded several West Bank towns. Settlers in the West Bank and Gaza were fearful and furious, and some took revenge on the open roads or wherever they could get at the Palestinians. As far as the security forces were concerned, attacks like the one on the taxi driver counted as a minor traffic accident. Right. In the course last year when I went back, I met a lot of soldiers who I had maintained touch with since I left in 2004, a wide range of opinions these guys had. And I met several in a group called Breaking the Silence. They formed after they got out of the service, after their 3 years of active service. Shavrom Shtika, I think it is in Hebrew. And these guys are now, they're very opposed to the occupation. And they, by the way, come from a wide range. These guys are Zionists, they're religious, they're settler soldiers, a few of them, left-wing, liberal, secular, the whole gamut. Anyways, I got to be friends with several of these guys. And one of them, we spent the morning, and he started telling his stories. And I'm not sure he had told them before, but it was like he turned the switch on the tape recorder, and this is some of what he told me. He told me that the days and nights of the violent patrols and searches all blended together, but as he talked, I kept hearing nonspecific references to 6-year-olds, and I asked if one incident had involved a child of that age. Yeah, he said, I remember it very well. It was an arrest operation in Jenin, one of the villages. When you take over a home, you tell everyone to get out of the house. The first person who comes out, you tell them to open up all the doors, get everybody outside, and you check IDs. Then you send in the first squad to check that there's no weapons hidden inside the house. Then everyone comes in and you start searching the place. You can imagine what it means when 15 people search an apartment. A lot of destruction. Usually you take the family and you put them in one room, a guard on them. The idea is you have them under supervision and they don't go around in the house. The second thing is that way they don't see what you're doing. But this time it was a very small home, and when we were searching their room, the kids were kind of in a corner outside and they were seeing everything. I remember this incident even though it was common, something that happens every night, but for some reason I remember this one very, very well. Now, he was ready to move on at this point and change the subject, but why do you remember this one kid? I pressed him. He paused and continued. Me and a friend of mine, while we were tossing the room, at some point I'm taking his school knapsack and, tossing it, everything outside to see what he had there, all his crayons and notebooks and things. And suddenly I see him staring at me, very scared. It's 2:00 in the morning. We just arrested his father in front of his eyes, and he's, totally traumatized, scared, crying. And for that 1 second, our eyes kind of connected, and he looked at me, and I looked at him. And of course, I just turned right away and continued to do what I'm doing, because you can't look at a 6-year-old and do what you have to do. Kids are always something very hard to deal. It's very trivial. It's not. But there was nothing different from any other night. I remember myself thinking, what the hell am I doing here? It's a school knapsack. What the hell am I doing here? There were families, we invaded their homes, and sometimes we stayed for days, sometimes for weeks. Now, just think about that. The idea of your home becoming your own jail, where you need to ask permission from a 19-year-old soldier to take a piss in your own home. It's not something that's happening far away. It's not foreign legionnaires who are doing this. It's not mercenaries. It's us. And that's the way he talked, except faster. It was all one long sentence. During the Intifada, we were running humanitarian supplies to various places, including to a UN hospital in Qalqilia, which is in the northern West Bank, right close to the Green Line. As we entered Qalqilia on March 12th, this is March 12th, 2002, the city streets were deserted except for armored personnel carriers and tanks and we drove slowly with emergency flashers on, windows open and the large UN flag flying from a rear fender. The city was under general curfew, and soldiers were rounding up Palestinian men and confining them in a school playground. We had arrived with a truckload of bread for the UN hospital, but soon we were diverted to other duties. In the citywide confusion, the hospital's pediatrician, Dr. Imad Hassan Kiwan, had disappeared. My assistant and I went to find him. An estimated 600 Palestinian men under the age of 40 stood or sat in the school playground, some blindfolded and most with hands tied behind their backs with the flexible plastic cuffs. They were held for most of the day and released one by one after computer checks determined that they were not on a wanted list. As the men left, their cuffs were clipped off and they walked into the street, rubbing badly swollen wrists. A cheerful IDF captain told me the doctor was not among the detainees. As we searched for the doctor, we blundered into an army foot patrol, warily searching the narrow streets and alleys. It was a tense moment that could have gone badly wrong. The platoon commander angrily ordered me and my assistant to leave, and I explained that we were looking for a UN doctor who was badly needed at the hospital. "Okay, we have some men detained over there. Go look," the soldier said. "If you find him, take him and get out fast. If not, get out. You can see what's happening here, and you are likely to be shot." 8 blindfolded men squatted against a wall under guard, and I called the doctor's name. To my surprise, considering how many Palestinians had been picked up that day, one answered, "Yes, here." A soldier removed the blindfold and cut Dr. Imad loose. He'd been held for 4 hours. His hands were red and swollen and deeply marked from the handcuffs. I wanted to get the doctor out of there before the soldiers changed their mind, but I was brought up short by another one of those random vignettes. As more Palestinians were marched into the alley and ordered to squat against the wall, one young soldier had just taken over guard duty. Sweating heavily in helmet, body armor, and ammunition pouches, he had a string of plastic handcuffs, and he was restraining the new prisoners as they arrived. Unaware that I was watching, he put the cuffs on each man, loosely at first, while he ripped a strip of cloth from a bundle of blindfold fabric. He carefully tucked the cloth strip under the plastic on each wrist before drawing the cuffs snug. Then he checked again that the cloth kept the restraint off the skin. I had never seen this done before, and I wondered what the soldier and his Palestinian captives were thinking. One last one. When I went back in 2006, I'm always amazed at the capacity that Palestinians and Israelis have both for some kind of mutual, I don't know what to call it, mutual antagonism, yet a mutual engagement as well. Maybe it's no surprise. We spent a lot of time driving up and down the West Bank, as I said, and, hours in the car every day, in the Jeep every day. And food was usually a safe topic and a neutral topic. I also, by the way, occasionally definitely alienated a lot of my Palestinian assistants, because when the suicide bombings were going on, I was pretty outspoken what I thought about that. So better to stick to the subject of food. Now, but even food could provide a platform for competitive discussion. And I had such a conversation in Jerusalem with 2 women, one Israeli and one Palestinian, about za'atar. Za'atar is the tangy herbal condiment prevalent throughout the Mediterranean. I asked the women, who were both well-read on many subjects, about its main ingredient. Was it oregano or was it thyme? Sorry, I guess you say oregano here, right? Was it oregano or was it thyme? I won't say which woman was the Israeli and which the Palestinian. It went like this. "It is oregano and sumac and salt," one said. "No, it's thyme, not oregano," said the other. "No, it is definitely oregano." "No, you are wrong, it is thyme." "No, you are totally incorrect, it is not thyme." Both women paused and agreed that za'atar does contain salt and usually olive oil. "And sumac." "No, it is not sumac, it is simsim." "No, it is sumsum, not simsim. Simsim is sesame, but it has sumac in it." "Those are not sesame seeds. One variety has, but only that one. The other has simsim." "But," I asked, "doesn't it have sesame seeds? I've never seen za'atar without the seeds in it." "No, simsim." "No, actually, sumsum." "What is the difference between simsim and sumsum?" I asked. "They are both the same," one woman said. She was right. I learned later it's a matter of pronunciation. So za'atar contains simsim and sumsum, I said. It depends on the variety of za'atar, one said. How many varieties are there, I asked. Rather sorry now I had started this, but I was absorbed by the edginess. We were not discussing 1948 or 1967, but a herbal mixture that all three of us agreed was as essential to life as the bread it's served on. 2. But what about sumac, I asked. They contain sumac also. Both, one woman said. Sometimes. Or one or the other, said her colleague. The women were still smiling, but through slightly clenched teeth, and I changed the subject. The argument followed me out the door. One woman whispered in my ear, "She doesn't know what she's talking about. It really is time." That afternoon, I went down to Kit Kat Coffee in Salah ad-Din Street in East Jerusalem with my friend Yosef, who has the definitive word on such things, and brought 4 large bags of za'atar, 2 varieties, one brown and one green, to take back to the United States. Both contained oregano. But then again, I might be wrong. And it turns out I was wrong, as I found out. The conversation continued again this year with another shopkeeper, so now it supposedly is time after all. But anyway, so thanks for that. And questions or?
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Philip Winslow discussing in the West Bank. I'd like to start off with a question. Based on your experiences in the West Bank, what are the possibilities for the future? I mean, that's always the $69,000 question, but I'd like to get your reflections and thoughts about what we can reasonably hope for in terms of resolving this terrible conflict.
I'll have to kind of mix the answer by saying that I'm hopeful because there's no other way to be. Somebody asked me this in a radio interview the other day and said, are you hopeful? And I said, yes, of course, because one has to be. You cannot throw up your hands and say this conflict cannot be solved. Yet at the same time, I'm afraid we may be in for more of the same. We have this conference coming up, supposedly in Annapolis for the end of November, and I think it's a bit of a fiction, really. I'm not sure that it exists outside the minds of the Secretary of State, and there have already been people saying, well, we must lower our expectations for this conference. But apart from the conference, yes, I think one should say that it can be solved, and it must be solved. It's too dangerous, it's too destabilizing, it's too damaging to the Palestinians, and it's too damaging to Israel. It's damaging Israeli society, is perhaps not to the degree of Palestinian society, but it's very, very dangerous. And now the mix is further complicated by Hamas in Gaza, not to mention the Hamas and the Fatah dispute, which has got very nasty now, but with Hezbollah in Lebanon and with Syria's involvement in Lebanon, and then, of course, all this business with Iran and not to mention Iraq. So at the core of a lot of these things, people sometimes say, well, the Palestinian-Israeli dispute really is not at the core of this. But I would argue for some very tough diplomacy to solve this because, number one, because it needs to be solved. You can't keep 4 million people, 4 million Palestinians under occupation. It's terrible for them. Their lives are a misery, and in addition to that, it's wrecking Israel, in my view. So I think, yes, now, but to answer your question, look, better minds than mine have been wrestling with this thing for nearly half a century now, and nobody seems to have come up with the answer. I think the two-state model, it may not be the best, but I don't see what else there is. And what I would like to see is some really strong diplomacy. I mean, a bit of a departure from the rather lukewarm diplomacy we've had under the current administration in Washington. What's interesting about this, and the reason that I say yes, it can be solved, is that opinion polls show repeatedly that Palestinians and Israelis want an end to this, and they believe in a two-state solution as the only thing going. I mean, the only other thing that seems to be talked about with great horror sometimes is a one-state solution, give the Palestinians full Israeli rights, and a lot of Israelis are telling me, well, that's the end of the Jewish state. So But yes, I would say that I think hope must be maintained, and I would just wish that Washington and European countries would take a much more proactive role. I'm sorry, that answer is probably completely inadequate, but, sir.
Welcome to Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion with journalist and United Nations aid worker Philip Winslow, discussing his experiences during the Second Intifada in the West Bank. At this point in the program, we'll take questions from the audience. Please line up at the microphone and be succinct, as there are many here who would like to ask questions. And Philip, you can call on people.
Okay. Right. Sir.
I find the title of your book a little disappointing. It makes it sound like it's a zero-sum game where we kill you, you kill us, and that's it, as if there's no cause to be had, as if there's no reason for the fighting, and that's, of course, wrong. Israel is a state dedicated to the supremacy of Jews. It is not a state of equal rights. The Palestinians are fighting to end that. Why can't we recognize their struggle for what it is, a struggle against oppression, a struggle against racism, and support them? How can there be any other solution? Thank you.
There is a lot of support for the Palestinian case, the Palestinian cause, and I think it's weakened by the poor diplomacy that has been exerted. And it's also been, I must say, exacerbated by the lack of vision on the Palestinian side. But on the subject of the title does not say it all about this thing, and it is a bit provocative, but it grew out of a discussion between a Palestinian and an Israeli, and the Israeli who heard this was Ami Ayalon, the former head of the Shin Bet. And the Palestinian said something to him about how we won. And Ayalon said, "What do you mean you won? You've lost a lot of people, and we've lost a lot of people." And the Palestinian said to him in reply, he said, "For the first time in 50 years, we are not the only people to suffer in the Middle East. Victory for us is to see you suffer." And Ayalon got thinking about that, and he thought, well, there is an element of this punishment, and this punishment and counter-punishment. So, and I find, yes, it's disappointing. The title may be disappointing, but the actual cycle of punishment and counter-punishment, I find perhaps even more disappointing, and that's what I would like to see stop. But you're right, it is not all that by any means. Yes, sir.
There seems to be like a near universal agreement that a two-state solution would in fact produce peace. But when you think about it, why would it? For example, you have some semblance of two states right now, where Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. It has an independent government. The settlements were destroyed and so on. And it's actually made things worse. So I'm wondering, is there some sort of challenge to this notion that a two-state solution would produce peace? It may be a good idea in its own terms, but as a vehicle for peace, I think it's questionable. But nobody seems to argue that.
I think nobody is really sure. And look, as somebody who supports, just so everybody knows my views on this, I believe in a two-state solution because I don't see any other way to go. But somebody once asked, I think it was an IDF chief of staff, well, all right, so what happens if the Palestinians have a state and then they launch a terror attack? And he said, well, Israel, we would know what to do. And it's just that I think that with a two-state answer to this, it is the only way that I think Israel is going to have security. The Palestinians, they're too bottled up, and they are too oppressed to give any kind of security to the state of Israel as long as this continues. So I would just say let's give it a try and see what happens, because there's no other model out there that I see that is being. I wish somebody would come up with a version. something else that would work. But I also think the Palestinians deserve a state of their own, and whether they can manage it or not, that's something for the future. But I would say let's start with that.
I know that Gaza is not your particular topic, but perhaps even Dr. Roy could address this. But my understanding is that Gaza, even though Israeli troops have withdrawn from the actual territory of Gaza, that it's really not currently an independent Palestinian territory. Is that accurate?
Yes, and I would say, and I'm sorry, the gentleman, you alluded to that as well, and I just forgot to answer it, that for all intents and purposes now, in 2005, Israel withdrew 9,000 settlers and its army bases from Gaza. But Gaza is still under the complete control of Israel. Israel controls the sea space, the airspace, and every point to and from Gaza. Palestinians cannot go into Gaza. They cannot go out of Gaza without special permits from the IDF. So. And meanwhile, the economy in Gaza has, over the past few years, just collapsed. I mean, something now like, they've shed, 7,000 or jobs since 70,000 workers in the private sector lost their jobs since last June. 85% of the factories have been shut down. Agricultural exports, which Gaza would be very good at, have completely ground to a halt because there are too many restrictions on their getting out. In Gaza, something like 80% of the families totally rely on international food aid, from UNRWA principally. For all intents and purposes, although Israel would dispute my phrasing, Gaza is still an occupied territory. The lady in the...
It's my understanding that there is only one exit from Gaza, and that is the exit into Egypt. Is that correct? And isn't it controlled by the Israelis?
Rafah, and you correct me, Dr. Roy, if I'm wrong, Rafah into Egypt is controlled. Eretz crossing on the northern crossing to and from Israel, which is the normal way that Palestinians, feel free to jump in if I get this wrong, but Rafah crossing, which is where the Palestinians by the tens of thousands used to cross into Israel to work, that is completely closed and has been closed to Palestinians for many months now, certainly since Hamas made its violent takeover in June. But then Rafah crossing, there are other crossings used for different purposes, but the other foot crossing into Egypt is controlled by Israel. That's correct.
So they cannot get their produce and their products out, and neither can they get raw materials in for their factories, is that right, to produce goods for sale. Their economy is being shut down by this occupation.
The economy has been pretty well crushed in Gaza. You're correct. They can't get produce out. And this is actually not something new. This was going on when I was there as well through 2004 and probably before that. But as far as agricultural produce getting out, that's correct. It can't, and raw materials getting in as well. You're correct.
Thank you.
Let me just try one in the back. Chap with the... Yes.
It seems that Palestinians are able to, however they do it, I'm not sure altogether, they do seem to be able to manufacture the rockets that they're constantly firing into Israel. So that part of their activities they seem to be able to flourish in. I have to strongly object to the first gentleman who came up to the microphone, characterizing Israel as a racist state, and I think one or two other comments that he made. I think he was mistaken about that. I don't think you can look at any Arab or Muslim state that is more tolerant of people and has given Arab citizens equal rights. They have the right to vote. They have the right to have political parties. They can run for the Knesset and serve in the Knesset.
This is Arab Israelis you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They have those rights. They're not denied them.
You've got several different strands going, but you're correct that they do have rights. Although you talk to Arab Israelis today in Israel, and a lot of them say they're treated like second-class citizens. But let me mention talk about the thing with the rockets. I'm glad you brought it up because if you hadn't, I would have. This is something that, when I say every point is closed to and from Gaza, what is not closed is the points that to shut these rockets off. And this is something that, number one, it's illegal under international law because these rockets are targeting civilians. They are targeting, into the town of Sderot. I don't know, 12 people have been killed over the last few years. It's not a lot, but they are still, civilian populations are being targeted by these rockets. So there is that. And in addition, this is just highly damaging to the Palestinian cause. Now, Hamas says, well, it's not us, it's the Islamic Jihad or the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, but Hamas certainly would be in a power or in a position, one would think and hope, to control us. But as long as every time a rocket is fired from Gaza into Israel, it has almost the same effect as the suicide bombs several years ago. It is almost a gift to the right-wing Israeli government because then they will continue. Nothing is going to move on the diplomatic front as long as the Palestinians fire rockets. I'm sorry, I cannot give the Palestinians a complete free pass, and I don't. So you're correct on that.
Also, what about the racism on the Arab side? The constant cultivation of anti-Semitism by Arabs and Muslims in general.
I would say there's plenty of racism to go around, and I'd actually kind of stay away from that because, look, human beings, being what they are, express all kinds of racist sentiments, and I've heard it on both sides there. And the way I deal with it is just I say I don't want to hear it. Now, whether it's an Israeli talking about an Arab or an Arab talking about a Jew, but I think there are other bigger problems, or I think that is more a side effect of some of the broader issues. And yeah, you're right. It's not nice, and people shouldn't do it.
Well, I think that goes to the problem of a state. How can Palestine become a state? It will become a base for war.
Sure, but look, in the United States, white Americans had, there was plenty of racism in the United States, and I don't know. I suppose eventually we grew up and got over it. I don't know. Maybe we didn't. People still say that there is still racism in the States against blacks, but I would hope that. I think those are growing pains in any type of society. I don't know, I'm not a sociologist, but yeah, I hope those go away.
The situation you described was particularly dangerous during the Second Intifada, and the work you were doing was bringing daily necessities, the necessities of life, into the West Bank. So it is, I hope, not a completely typical situation, but what kind of future, just normal future, were the people in the West Bank looking for? What did mothers hope for their children? I've known schools, going to school was sometimes difficult. Give me a sense of what they're looking for as they look ahead.
Right now, I'm sorry to say that they have very little hope for what's ahead. That's a good question, and that's one that preoccupied me on my return. You ask mothers, well, what about our kids? How are they going to go to school? How are they going to do this and do that? And they say, And a lot of them are just resigned. They are simply giving up. But what they want, and this, again, is part of the reason I wanted to write this book, was that I wanted to introduce ordinary Palestinians to you, or say to people who haven't met them, and ordinary Israelis such as soldiers to people like you, because there is some common ground. And all the Palestinian women and men I know, and most of the kids, they want a future like your kids have had. They desperately want education. And the educational system, I mean, UNRWA provides, as does the Palestinian Authority, the PA, provides basic education up through high school, and it's not real great. But they want to go abroad to study, and something I will fault Israel for quite a lot is preventing Palestinians, particularly those in Gaza, from pursuing their education, both in the West Bank and outside. The Shin Bet and the IDF say that, no, they're a security threat. We cannot let Palestinian students go from out of Gaza, leave Gaza to pursue their education. And anyway, this gets into another story, which is keeping moderates down. But yes, I don't know if that answers the question, but they want the same thing as your kids want. Most of them. A few want other things, but I think that will go away as well. Sir.
After 60 years of war, you'd think it's a steady state, but it does not seem to be. Israel, the IDF has always been essentially invincible. They whipped all Arab armies in 6 days, and that's the way the world has seen them. However, last summer, the war, they didn't seem so invincible, and the Israelis can look just a few hundred miles to the east and see the world's most powerful army in the process of being defeated. I wonder if they see time running out, in the same way that apartheid South Africa saw time running out, and finally that realization caused them to make a reasonable accommodation with their minorities, or in the case of South Africa, majorities. Do you think the Israelis see this progression, and do you think they see that as a solution in the end? Thank you.
There are two strands of that, I would say, and again, I'm far from an expert, but two strands of that I see in Israel. One is the military, and there are even divisions within the Israeli military, but many in the IDF, the Air Force and the Navy, say we must always be on our guard. We are destined to live in a perpetual state of war, and we must keep the army strong. And that's why last year's mess with Hezbollah in Lebanon was such a shock and it nearly brought the government down. I mean, it's recovering now, but because Israel was not prepared to deal with this changed nature of warfare that groups like Hezbollah can throw at them. But many Israelis, and I am surprised by the number of Israeli civilians and soldiers who tell me, soldiers privately when they're off duty, say this is not the way to go. You know, there has got to be another paradigm other than living as a fully militarized society. And I know Peretz Kidron, who's he translated Rabin's memoirs, an old Israeli lefty. He told me that, he said, look at the figures of Israelis emigrating. He said, young Israelis do not want to stick around to live in a militarized society like this. You don't want to bring up their kids. And there was a piece in the New York Times today about Israelis through this grandmother clause. If you had a grandparent, that you can become an American citizen. An awful lot of Israelis are simply leaving because many of them tell me that the dream of a Jewish state is dying, and part of what's killing it is the continuing occupation. Now, this is not something, by the way, that I'm seeking out through my political beliefs or notions, but it's what Israelis voluntarily say to me. Now, mind you, most of them tend to be secular, liberal, left-wing, but some religious Israelis as well. So this is kind of a bifurcation in thinking in this society from what I know of it. The lady in the back.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. There's 3 points that you brought up that I wanted to just make a comment about. One is about racism, one is about cycles of violence, and one is about an alternative to the two-state solution, if I may. I think that when on the West Bank you have major highways, good thoroughfares, that are Jews-only highways, that's racism. You don't allow Palestinians. When you build walls and fences around their homes, separating villages, separating homes, separating them from their fields, not allowing them into their crops, that's racism. When you have Palestinian living in Israel who are not allowed to cohabitate with their spouses if they come from outside of Israel, that's racism. When you have people who for 30 years, I believe, have had to have a pass to get into Israel, to stay with their spouse, and now those are being rejected if they're Arabs, that's racism. And the schools are highly segregated. So those are just a few examples. In terms of the cycles of violence, I think as we stand here, Arab houses are being mowed down, olive trees, fields continue to be torn up, people are harassed at checkpoints every day, and I have stopped remembering the names and places of all the people that the young children as well as women and lots of innocents who are being killed every week on the Palestinian side, and I hear very few, and there'll be one remarkable, and then we'll know that name. So that was about the cycles of violence. I think it's a word, that's a phrase we should drop. There aren't cycles. There's a real disproportionate, as you well know. I'm not trying to lecture you or tell you something you don't know. In terms of an alternative, you've probably also thought about this, or I don't know what discussion there is there. Maybe you could tell us, but people have talked about Israel truly becoming a democratic state, not just a state for Jews, but a state for everybody who's there, and literally giving equal rights, human rights, the right of return. If you're a Jew and you have never ever touched foot in Israel, you have a right to go and live there. Palestinians who've been pushed off the land and forced out of the country are not allowed to return to their property. So one democratic state is another possibility. I think I'm inclined to agree with somebody else who just mentioned a while ago that we already have 2 states. One is an open-air prison under occupation, which is illegal. It's against international law. The other is that they are all within one state, the state of Israel. So in a sense, the worst of both possibilities exists. But people have tried to talk positively about a one-state solution.
Yeah. Let me kind of wrap up some of those together into one answer, which is probably a lot broader than we've got time for, but it's to do with a settler enterprise. Now, whether you call it racism, I'm going to leave charges of racism to somebody else, but what I'll talk about is what I see on the ground. You mentioned something quite interesting about the highways. In the West Bank now, yes, there is a dual highway system, and the Israeli, I forget what it's called in Hebrew, but it's called the Everything Flows Plan, and it's basically Israeli settlers on top, so to speak, and the Palestinians underneath. And the roads, an astonishing, I don't know, it's something like plus $500 million US a year is being spent on the infrastructure alone, such as these roads. And they are fancy roads that connect the settlements and provide settlers a smooth ride into Jerusalem. Whereas the Palestinians, the West Bank is becoming carved up into a series, you might say, of cantons. And this has happened fast over the past few years, but even a year ago, people were talking about the West Bank being cut into three sectors, north, central, and south. They don't even talk about that anymore. It's now referred to as kind of a cantonization. And if you look at the UN OCHA maps, which are accurate, and whatever you think about the UN, they do great maps. And you look at these little purple blotches, which are the settlements across the West Bank, connected by various roads. And the road system this is all about the settlers and to make the settlers' lives easier and more comfortable. And this is, whether you call it racism or something else, it has very much to do with the control of the land. And I kind of refer to, and I don't mean this to be insulting, but the settler enterprise I sort of view as a strong tail wagging a rather lethargic dog. The settler enterprise in Israel is enormously powerful. In Israel's system of the coalition governments, they wield an enormous amount of power. So, and an awful lot is done for them and by them. And another thing that is happening in the Israeli army, by the way, is an increase in the percentage of religious and settler soldiers. And this is in the mid to higher ranks of, say, lieutenant colonels, brigadiers on up, who come from the settler movement, the settler enterprise. So this all has to do with that. Now, on the cycles of violence, the violence, it continues, although in the West Bank, there has been less of it than during the Second Intifada. Now, in Gaza, the violence has been just extreme, and I don't know, thousands of houses. How many thousand houses? 4,000 to 6,000 houses in Gaza, or family units, not say individual structures, have been demolished. And this gets back to the punishment thing, and I'm sorry to say. But anyway, your other question, another solution, a fully democratic Israel, I don't know. That is, I'm sorry to say, is beyond my analytical capability. So,
suicide violence. I thought it might be helpful. Maybe I'm not correct in this, but my understanding is that Israel was carved out of Palestine in 1948. There were a number of wars. There was a war in 1967. Settlements started shortly after that. And yet the first suicide bomber, if I'm not mistaken, was in 1994. Now, I don't think it's helpful to characterize Palestinians as, suicide bombers way back. This was long after the settlement process started, and long after the West Bank was carved up, the process that had already begun.
There were actually some suicide bombs, Palestinian suicide bombs in the 80s. I can't remember what year, 84, 85, there were a few. But what is the proper response? Geez, I don't know. I would think that what is not the proper response is going in and blowing up the home of the relatives of the now dead bomber. That is carrying punishment rather a step too far. But, I guess I would like to say that let's look at where we are now. I went through the whole thing with the suicide bombing, 3 years of it. I was around them. I was in them. And they have stopped now. Palestinians, for whatever reasons. Now, there are other attacks, but we're talking about suicide bombs, people blowing up pizza parlors and discotheques and that sort of thing. As far as I know, that hasn't happened for a long time now in the West Bank. The Palestinians, I think, not. Look, I'll have to say, I never had a Palestinian say to me, suicide bombs are wrong on moral grounds. It's not right to blow up people in a restaurant. But anyway, for whatever reason, they have stopped now. So I would like to see it. Sure.
Wouldn't the Israelis say what they're doing is working? That's why they've stopped, that they haven't just stopped because the Palestinians decided not to do it, but they've stopped because of all these barriers and things that we all think are horrible. But the Israelis will say, we're not doing it because it's horrible. We're doing it to keep the suicide bombers out. It's like the lady with the stick to keep away the elephants, They say there are no elephants. Well, it's working. What's the truth here?
Well, look, during the Intifada, all the barriers, when Palestinians could barely move 10 meters without being stopped, that still did not stop the suicide bombings. Now, the Israelis say, and the consensus that I hear is that, yes, the barrier, and this, by the way, the barrier I'm talking about is these 9-meter-high blocks and the fence, 90% of it's fence around and through the West Bank, that this stops suicide bombings. Now, whether it does or doesn't, Israel, by the way, is entitled under international law to build a barrier on its own land, on the 67 borders. A wall on the Green Line, yes, they can build a wall 10 miles high if they want to, but the problem with the wall is where it goes elsewhere. Now, this is another whole subject, this business of the wall, but where it cuts into the West Bank, and I think the figures now that I hear are, if at its current rate and current projected construction, it's going to take another 13% of the West Bank, something like that. But anyway, whether these measures stop it or not, there has to be a point at which, all right, recently, for example, Ehud Olmert and others have been saying, all right, we will ease the checkpoints. We're going to remove some of the checkpoints and make it easier for the Palestinians to move around. Shin Bet and the army say, no, that is a real mistake, because if we start removing the checkpoints, that will allow the terrorists to get into Jerusalem. I don't buy that. I mean, the first suicide bombing, if that happened, if they made things easier, the first suicide, I don't think the Palestinians would do it. I know they wouldn't do it, because they are tired of that. They see it as counterproductive, and there is no point in paying the price that they paid before, in paying that price again. I honestly believe that they are finished with that as a tactic for now. Now, if the lid stays on this thing, if this situation is not resolved, people are already talking about the third Intifada with great violence, and people on both sides are talking about it. And I hate to hear this talk, but that's why, again, this situation is so dangerous and really needs to be solved. Let me move on, if you don't mind, to yes. Yeah.
Yes, hi. Thank you for coming. I have been to Palestine and Israel 3 times, and I have done a lot of crisscrossing on the ground. And I'm very concerned that there's been a lot of talk about the suicide bombers and not really a lot of talk about what Palestinian society represents. And that it's been a very difficult time for them to be able to gather themselves and present themselves as a state if their infrastructure has been destroyed. There are students at MIT who do not have any records of where they went to high school, because the Israeli military made a point to destroy anything that had any record of any Palestinians through their Ministry of Education. They made a point to have that destroyed. There's been a lot of bad behavior, if you want to put it that way, on both sides. But I really think the inequality and the injustice of what's going on with the Palestinians not being able to get the full benefit of their statehood, and that there are still settlements that are being built on Palestinian land, and that the wall is way within the borders of the Palestinian land and not on the 67 borders. So my friends who are Israeli Jews are very upset by this lack of democracy that they are experiencing in Israel. They are working for a just peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. And they do not feel the Palestinians who live within the confines of Israel, if you want to call them Israeli Arabs, they do not have access, as the Israeli Jews do, to resources. And as far as the racism, I know that the Ethiopian Jews that I spoke with at length know that they will never have other than a menial job in the Israeli state. And if I can just finish by saying that if you want to talk about why there's anybody that is willing to blow themselves up, which I don't agree with, but it's out of desperation. When I was there were 3 kids that were 13 years old, unknowing to their families. They were so hopeless And they were the geeky kids, really good with computers and probably would have had a good future, but they didn't believe that. And so they decided one afternoon that's what they were going to do. To me, it speaks of a desperation. It's not unlike what happened in South Central LA.
Sure, it is desperation, and people who are under occupation to this degree, and let me make this clear about the occupation, that almost every aspect of the Palestinians' lives are controlled. As one soldier, I write about him in a book, guy I'd known very well for several years now, he said, we tell them what time to go to bed at night, we tell them what time to get up in the morning, we tell them when they can cross the checkpoint and what they can carry across the checkpoint with them. And this degree of control, yes, people will resist, and historically, through history, they have done and they will do. Now, then you get into the question of the tactics, and I'm sorry, as far as I'm concerned, bombing civilians is illegal and immoral. But yes, you're right. I mean, if you're talking about justice, if you keep 4 million people penned up like this and controlling, and I mean control, you see this every day, whether it's from East Jerusalem or from Hebron all the way up through Nablus, Tulkarm, Qalqilia, and Jenin, and they cannot move at all, and they cannot pursue. And actually, this thing about the education, I find one of the saddest and most painful things to witness. Say a student in Gaza who got a scholarship to study in Germany. I forget what he was to be studying, but anyway, the Israelis wouldn't let him out. And so his scholarship went away. He lost the thing. Now, that I find just particularly cruel, is denying people the right to have an education, but you're correct. Sorry, sir, I know you've been waiting, but I just wanted to give, next for you, okay? But let the lady in the red shirt.
We'll take your question and one more, and then I think we're going to have to conclude.
I hadn't heard the idea of the Third Intifada as inevitable, and I'm wondering, I'm leaving on Friday night for a trip with the Jewish Voice for Peace Health and Human Rights Project, and I wonder if you can say a little more about what your expectations about what might touch off a Third Intifada would be.
I dare not say it. I mean, I don't even want to think about it, because the Second Intifada was so destructive. You've got me on that one. I'm completely stuck. But I would say that, I guess I would say that if this occupation continues at this level, if there is not something to give the Palestinians hope for change, because when you take away the hope of a people, this is what makes them do crazy things. And I think there has got to be some compromise, serious compromise, and I don't mean like releasing another 500 prisoners of the 11,000 that are being held in Israeli jails. I don't mean stopping this road, this E1 development, something. It's got to be something more substantive than that, and I think this is going to require, so I'll kind of turn the answer around. It's not exactly the answer you were looking for, but saying that what I think is required to prevent it is some very urgent and muscular diplomacy on the part of the United States and whoever else. But again, Abu Allah Ahmed Correa was talking about this the other day. I mean, that the Third Intifada is inevitable if this peace conference doesn't produce results. And I mean, that's the kind of rhetoric, frankly, that doesn't do anybody any good. And I get very impatient with that, because although he's been a negotiator for a long time, that's just the kind of thing that gets people thinking. But then again, and I'm sorry, I'm not answering your question adequately at all, but you take away people's hope totally, and resistance will continue. And that's why I urgently hope, fingers crossed, inshallah, and all that something gets done pretty soon. Sorry, I can't.
But you might be able to help. As a favor to my mother, would you say in the next 3 weeks it's probably not going to happen?
No, you're safe to go. And anyways, go anyways, even if we're going to happen in 3 weeks. I mean, everybody ought to get in on this. This is, by the way, this is another thing that the problem with this whole conflict is Israelis and Palestinians are both so insulated. Listen, I had a guy say to me, he's a longtime Israeli peace campaigner and an army veteran, fought in the invasion in '82. And he said to me one day, we were talking, and I know this guy very well, he said, you, Philip, you know pretty much about this, but you're an outsider. You can never really understand what it's like for us. And that's nonsense. I mean, of course people can understand, and they are too wrapped up in this, so anything to internationalize this. But anyway, take a chance. Nothing's going to happen in 3 weeks. Now, that's bad luck to say something like that.
Was there one more question from the audience?
That chap with the beard again, he had...
Okay, could you make it short? Thank you.
I wonder if Israel is so misguided in keeping the educated young people. I think most of the Islamic terrorism that we know about has been done by educated people who were affluent, who came from good families and had good education. So I don't think that they're necessarily so mistaken in what they're doing. And also what about the question of the Jews that were forced? I mean, just to give a balanced account of things, there were 700, 800, 900,000, I'm not sure the precise number, that were Jews that were forced out of Arab and Muslim countries back in the late 40s and early 50s. So
they
have no right of return. They were not given any kind of...
Would you ask the question, please, because we have to conclude. No. If you have a question, would you just state it?
Well, I just wanted to point out that, to balance the account here, those people were never given reparations or anything like that. They just had to leave.
Yeah, but that's another story. We're trying to...
Why is it another story? It's part of who's there.
We do have to finish. So your point was made. Thank you. Philip, before we conclude, I just would like you to end this by perhaps telling us what and this may be an unfair question, but what was your most poignant experience in your years in the West Bank? Or is there a particular experience, event, interaction that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, actually, I had a lot of them were really miserable and violent and things that I would not describe here, even though I've written about some of them. Things that were said to me were absolutely miserable and totally depressing, but I'll tell you a good one that actually had happened 2 weeks ago. Thanks for that. When I want to get my personal compass reset, I go to a Palestinian school. Now, by the way, I should say that I'm a little bit one-sided because I worked on the Palestinian side, okay? I've never been in an Israeli school, and I'm sure that would be interesting as well. But the Palestinian kids are really sparky. The boys are a little bit too sparky for me. They're a bit rowdy. But whenever I really want to get my compass reset, I go to a school, preferably in Jenin. Jenin, the northernmost big town in the West Bank, which has seen a great deal of violence through the Intifada. And I went there with a friend of mine last week, just because I know a lot of the teachers there. And these teachers really do, some heroic work to try to keep the kids out of the struggle, to teach them the basic stuff, and to deal with their traumas, which are many. So we walked into the Jenin Girls' School, which is a favorite place of mine. These are 8 and 10-year-olds, and a social welfare counselor was painting their faces. So I decided to have my face painted too. And these kids are, and there was, I don't know, this story means absolutely nothing except to anybody except me. But there was a girl who was about 8 years old, and she had her nose painted orange and a green cheek and a red cheek. And this kid was really wide awake, really on the ball, and she was 8. And she said, so are you married? Of course, the Palestinians, they always want to know, are you married? No, have you got a girlfriend? And I changed the subject. And anyway, this kid and all of them, and in this school, there are 1,000, I think there are 1,100 girls who do 2 shifts. The school is so crowded that they do them in 2 shifts throughout the day. And these kids in particular are the hope for all of this, for Palestine, for Israel. And I'm sorry, this does sound a little bit corny, but if I could show you their pictures, you would see. And this is the answer, I think, to where's this lady who asked about, what do they want? Well, I mean, they want a normal life, and that's all. That's not a terribly good description, but the kids in these schools are always, I find, a great inspiration for me. Not all of them, but most of them. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Philip Winslow. Thank you. You have been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum, recorded in October 2007, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For more information about this program, entitled In the West Bank, featuring Philip Winslow, or about our ongoing radio series, visit us on the web at cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Sarah Roy, and thank you for joining us.
That was for the radio audience, but this is for you. Next Wednesday, on October 24th, Cambridge Forum continues its mini-series on China, looking forward to the Beijing Olympics. And next week, we're going to look back. Author Larry Bergreen will be here discussing his latest book, Marco Polo. That program is here at First Parish at 7:30 p.m. And I know that we all hope we're still in the baseball playoffs. But I hope you can join us for Marco Polo. So now we do have books at the back table, and it's time to fold the chairs.